The CSS3 property for border image is a little tricky, but it can allow you to create flexible boxes with custom borders. You can accomplish this with a single div or element tag and a single image. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can use border image. The file that we're going to be working on is reminiscent of one of the other files. It just is a pretty simple page with 3 divs on it, and we're going to be using these divs to apply the various border values and seeing how it can change the way this looks. These are the image files that I'm going to be working on for this set of exercises. I just wanted to show you them before we plug them into the border image because they will change significantly depending on the settings that we're going to use. This image, the pattern border, is 200 by 200 pixels. The grass border is also 200 by 200 pixels. And then the other border that I'm going to be using is this vine border that I created, and it's about 456 by 450 pixels. So I just wanted to point out that these are different sizes, and you'll see when we plug those into our page how it affects how the graphic looks on the web page. Here's the HTML page that we're going to be using for this lesson. It's very similar to a page that we used in previous exercise. We simply have 3 div tags that appear within an article tag on our page, and here I have 3 selectors that will target each of those divs, and of course they're empty because we haven't applied anything to those div tags yet. We'll begin by adding the border image to the first div. In order to add border image, you're simply going to write border-image, and then you're going to use the URL and pass on in the parentheses, and then we'll put the path to the image tag. So my image is in a directory called images, and the image that we're going to be looking is called pattern border. Now if we just leave this as is and we save and we go into the browser and we refresh, you're going to see that we don't actually see anything appearing on the page. The reason why is we need to specify a border width. Currently, we don't have any sort of border width specified, so I'm going to add a border width to this selector. I'll just make it 30 pixels. And I'll save, and if we go back into the browser and refresh, you can now see that I do get somewhat of a border. Now I haven't passed on any settings to control the border, so what it's done is it's taken that graphic and it's just shrunk it down and placed it in the corners of my div box. In just a moment I'll show you how we can augment some of the value settings so that we can change how this looks. But before I do so, it is worth mentioning that in some of the browsers, let's look at Firefox for instance, you won't actually see the border appearing. And the reason why is because some browsers also need you to define that the border is set to solid. So I'm going to actually do that up in my div property that I've already defined. So I'm just going to set the border to solid. And as soon as I save this page and refresh it inside of Firefox, you're now going to see that the border does appear. So that is an important declaration that you're going to need to include if you want to use border image. The first browser that I demoed this in was Chrome, and Chrome doesn't need that, but some of the browsers do need that. So make sure that you specify border solid in order for the border image to show up in a wide range of browsers. As usual, whenever you're using CSS3 properties like this, it would be advantageous for you to check the Can I Use website, and I simply searched for border image, and then it's going to show me support for border image. You can see that most of the modern browsers do support border image. However, it is worth noting that IE 10 and earlier versions do not support this feature. So if you are going to use this, make sure you do include fallback content. Also, when you use Can I Use, this is going to show you many of the browsers that people are using, but it doesn't show you all of them. If you want to see them all, you can click Show All, and this will give you a full list of all the browsers. So you can go back to earlier versions and make sure that what you're using is totally supported. You can see right here, if I check, and I'll have to scroll up, but the iOS Safari and Safari actually didn't support the border image until version 6 and 6.1. So if you are using these earlier versions of the browsers, or if you think your users are using those earlier versions of the browsers, it is important to add the vendor prefix of -webkit-, and then you'll pass on the exact same rule that you have. Once you do that, then this CSS3 rule will work in those older browsers. So I always recommend that you check the Can I Use website and make sure that the features that you want to include are supported in the browsers that you're trying to target and the versions of browsers that you're trying to target. All right, let's augment some of the settings that we have in here and add some additional settings so that we can control how this border is going to display. Inside my border image value, I'm going to add some additional settings. And what we'll add is we're going to add a numeric value, and then I'm also going to add a keyword that will control how the border is going to display. Let me show you this first, and then I'll come back and tell you what this is doing. If we go back into the browser and I refresh the page, you can now see that the border has changed drastically. Now it's taking that initial graphic that I made and tiling it throughout. So what's happening here is the first number that I passed on, the 65 value, is setting the border width. This border width property is using shorthand notation, so it's being applied to all edges of my box. If I go back into my CSS and I change this setting to 65 and 10, let's say, and we go back and we refresh in the browser, you can see how the border tiles on my image is drastically changed. What's happening here is it is tiling the horizontal faces of the box differently than the vertical faces of the box. We'll go ahead and we'll set that back to the 65, and when we set 65, it's setting the borders all around the box. You can actually plug in up to 4 values here, and just like when you do regular border declarations, it follows the clockwise hands of a clock, where you would first define top, then right, then bottom, and then left. So if you plug in one property, all of the sides are going to equally take on that value. If you plug in 2 properties, the top and the bottom are going to be the first value, the right and the left will be the second value, and if you plug in 4 values, it'll apply top, right, bottom, and left. So keep that in mind as you utilize borders. The second value that I plugged in here is going to specify how the image is fitted to the 4 sides of the border. The possible values are round, repeat, and stretch. If you only use one of these values, it's going to be taken for all 4 sides of the border. With 2 values, it'll apply to the top and the bottom, and the second ones will apply to the left and the right. Or if you have 4 values, it'll apply to each of the 4 sides of your box. Let's look at this in the browser with these original settings. And so that I can show you how this changes, I'm going to open up my developer tools and I'll just change some of these settings here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change round to repeat so that you can see what happens when I change this to repeat. When I change this to repeat, you can see that a subtle change occurs. There's not too much of a difference that is happening right here, but what's happening now is the image is tiled, it's repeated to fill the area. When we use the round option, it's a slight variation on the repeat option, and it distributes the tiles in such a way that they end nicely and they connect a little bit more cleanly. Generally, I like to use round, but you'll have to try this because it depends on the image that you're using. The other option that we have is stretch. And when you use stretch, you can see that the graphic changes quite a bit. The stretch option stretches the image to fill the border area. Now that you understand the basics of border image, let's apply some of the other graphics that I've created to these other boxes so that we can see how they're affected by the various settings that we can plug in. For my next div, I'm going to set the border width, And again, I'm just going to use 30 pixels. And then I'm going to set my border image. We'll start off by setting the size of the area that is taken to draw the border to 70. It is worth noting that when you set the numeric values for the border image, if you're indicating pixels, you don't have to put the px. You can pass on pixels, which don't need any extension, or you can use percent, and they would need the percent sign to follow them, like so. I'm going to use round for specifying how the image is fitted to the sides of the border. Let's save this and look in the browser. Now you can see the vine border is going to fill in only a portion of the box, and the reason that it's only hitting the top and the bottom portion of the box is because my graphic only has artwork on the top and on the bottom. Once again, we can augment the settings that are used inside of this to change how this graphic fills this particular box. It's going to be easier just to do this in the developer tools, so I'll open those up inside of my browser. I'm going to target box 2, and here's the rules that are being used, and then I can experiment with these values. Let's just change some of these settings so that you can see what happens. If I change the border size area to a lower number, you can see how the graphic actually appears bigger and it doesn't fill the box very well. As I increase this number, you're going to end up seeing more of the graphic displayed. You'll usually find a sweet spot depending on the size of the element that you're trying to apply the border to and the graphic that you've created. For this particular one, 60 looks pretty good. 50 is cutting off a little bit of the vines right here, so it looks like starting at about 60 I can see most of the vines. As I increase that number higher, you can see that my artwork gets smaller and smaller, and more of the artwork ends up tiling. Sometimes it might take you a little bit of time to come up with artwork that is going to tile in an acceptable way. This vine looks okay, but you can see there are areas where it doesn't seamlessly come together. I really recommend experimenting with your artwork and how it's going to work with your web page so that you can get something that's going to work acceptably. This border image feature is pretty neat and it does have some great potential, but it is a little tricky to work with, so it'll take some patience for you to be able to flesh out how you can use it optimally. Let me just show you what happens when we change the fitting for the border. If I change this to repeat, carefully look at the graphic and see how it changes. The differences are very subtle, but you can see here where the graphic comes together, it's not quite as clean as it was before. I think round gives me better results. For this particular graphic, when I use stretch, I really don't see any difference, and that's because my image is actually bigger than the box that it's filling. So when I stretch it, it doesn't actually have to be stretched. The stretch is only going to really kick in once the shape is going to be larger than your graphic. Then the graphic will get stretched. I can also pass on different values here, as I mentioned. So you can see if I use 60 and 100, 60 is for the top and the bottom, which we don't have bottom graphic, and then 100 is for the left. You can see how this graphic is starting to get squished, or it actually appears smaller. If we increase that value anymore, you'll see more of a significant difference. In addition to that, I can also change the fitting right here. So if I use round and stretch, you can see that I'll get further difference in how the border gets applied. I would really encourage you just to experiment with the graphic that you're using for the border and these settings so that you can find something that works in an acceptable way. Let's make a couple more changes to our last graphic right here. This time I'm going to set the border width to 50 pixels, and then we're going to set the border image, and we'll just begin by using 50 and round for the settings. Let's save this and look at it in our browser. You can see that the border is much wider, and that's a result of me changing the border width. Notice what happens if I change this down to 5. You can see how the border gets very small. So the border width is going to work in conjunction with how wide the actual border is. The image is going to fill that particular amount of space. If we change our settings right here to stretch, you're going to see that for this particular image, the graphics actually start to get a little bit blurry. They just aren't quite as clean as using round. Let me show you what happens when we use repeat. Repeat really looks no different from round for this particular graphic, and that's probably because my graphic is fitting pretty nicely in this size box. Let me show you what happens if we change the overall size of our boxes. I'm going to go into the rule that I have for my div, and I'm going to change the overall width to 750 pixels. This is going to prevent the images from appearing side by side, but it will give you a good indication of how the borders are going to look on different size boxes. You can see that the first box that we're using doesn't really seem to be affected too much by the changes. If we do change some of the settings here though, for instance if we change this to stretch, you can see that it's going to stretch the graphic out. If we change it to repeat, again there's just going to be a subtle change in how these connect at the edges. I really feel for this particular graphic that round works the best. Experimenting around with both the border width, if I change this to 10, you can see it gets smaller, or if we change it to like 40 pixels, it gets much larger. And then changing the number right here is going to give you different results. Some of these might be desirable, others not so much. But you can see that I can get a really interesting border by simply tweaking these edges right here. So sometimes you might find something unexpected, but it ends up being something that you really like simply by adjusting these numeric values. Again, feel free to change some of these too and mix them up. You can actually, as I mentioned, put 4 different values into your box and it'll affect how the image gets tiled. I don't really think this looks very good, but I just wanted to show you that it is possible. Let's just leave that at 85 for now. You can see that my vine image actually looks pretty good stretched out on to this image right here. We didn't actually use stretched, we used round, but it just repeats and it seamlessly comes together. The top actually ends up stitching together a little bit better than the sides on this particular image. Let me show you what happens if I change this to stretch. You can now see a significant difference in how the graphic is being applied, and that's because now the box is longer than the original graphic, so the graphic has to stretch to fill this box. And once again, we'll come down to our third box right here that has the grass edge, and if I change this to repeat, you can see that there really is no difference, but if we change it to stretch, you can see that the graphic gets blurrier, especially on the horizontal edges when it actually is stretching the graphic out. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, the graphic that you're using, and how you want the file to look, you'll need to adjust these values so that you can get something that will be acceptable to your needs. Border image is pretty fun to work with, and you can get all kinds of interesting and creative results by adjusting some of these values.